They give away billions of their own money. If you added it up, it would total more than the GDP of many countries. They are part of a new class of mega philanthropists, billionaires directing their profits to solve the world's problems. It's certainly generous, but is it also problematic? With us to tackle that in New York, Matthew Bishop, Managing Director of the Rockefeller Foundation and author of Philanthrocapitalism, How the Rich Can Save the World. That's him on the left. And Anand Giridharadas, journalist and author of Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. And back here in our studio, Rudyard Griffiths, Senior Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and philanthropic advisor to some of Canada's largest foundations. And Linda McQuaig, journalist, co-author of Billionaire's Ball, Gluttony and Hubris in an Age of Epic Inequality. She also wrote The Trouble with Billionaires, which we all remember well, and it's good to have you two here in our studio. And to our friends in New York City, thank you for joining us on TVO tonight. Anand, just because you've got this new book out, Winners Take All, I want to start with you. We'll spend a few minutes together and then bring everybody else into the conversation. This book, I guess I should say, first of all, welcome back to TVO. It's nice to see you again. Thanks for coming on.
This is actually one of the first TV shows I ever did a long time ago, so it's great to be back with you.
And you're still taking our calls, which is a beautiful thing. Let's start with the fact that this started for you as a speech in 2015 to the Aspen Institute. You were surrounded by a lot of wealthy philanthropists in that room. What happened then?
I was part of this fellowship at the Aspen Institute, and there are many around the world like this. There's the Davos Fellowships and TED Fellowships and Clinton Fellowships, and there's all these fellowships that try to take young leaders, often young business leaders, and have them think about giving back more, starting social enterprises, doing philanthropy, having businesses that engage in conscious capitalism. And I had started to observe and continue to observe in this fellowship experience that we lived in this very paradoxical time that started to grate on me more and more as I got into that world, where on one hand it was very clear that we lived in an age of historic generosity. Then all the numbers you cited, rich people giving back on a historic scale. At the other end of the age spectrum, young people on elite college campuses in the United States almost universally wanting to change the world and make a difference. And seemingly every young person in those spaces has a plan to go to Africa and start a social enterprise that will turn recycled poop into coffee, which will somehow fund a tote bag that will make a difference. And there seemed to be all this generous activity. But here in the United States, this has also been, famously, the most unequal time in 100 years, the worst time to be a middle or working class American in 100 years, an era of simmering and now boiled over rage, and a time in which many, many Americans feel correctly the system to be rigged against them, the American dream as we know it to be elusive, and social mobility to be all but dead unless you're born at the top and only wish to stay there. And so I became interested in how those two things could be squared. How is it that we live in this time that is so generous by every measure and so unjust in so many other ways? And I went on a journey of investigation, of actually spending time. I'm a reporter, and I spent time with the people in these worlds who were doing this and who were often behind the scenes actually wrestling with these very questions. They weren't unaware of these questions and who grappled with them themselves. And what I found, in short, was that a lot of the when the winners of our age step into the arena of public problem solving, they bring their wits, their talents, their money, their spreadsheet analysis skills, and various other assets. However, they also bring their tastes and their taboos. And when the winners step into social change, they don't just hang out in the back row. They sit in the front row. They end up on the board of directors of social change. And they change what change is. They change how many of us think about change. And they delimit a lot of kinds of change that are threatening to them. And so you end up with the kind of change that keeps the winners on top and preserves the system that keeps them winning and shuts most Americans out. And so I concluded from this reporting that a lot of what passes for generosity in our time is kind of an attempt to masquerade as justice, but is not, and that giving functions as a kind of wingman of continued taking. And this idea of changing the world that you hear from Mark Zuckerberg and others functions as a kind of wingman of keeping your world the same and not being regulated and not paying your proper taxes and not paying your workers enough. And this kind of idea of making a difference that we hear from a lot of these rich people functions as a wingman of making a killing and actually not changing anything.
Let me follow up with this. Do you think they understand that they are contributing to the problems that they are themselves trying to solve?
I think some do and some don't. But one of the staggering things I found is how many actually do at least quietly feel that. And look, there are people who I think fully believe that their hedge fund flash trading those commodities or their Silicon Valley company simply by growing is liberating humanity. There are people who believe that. But I think it's hard, if you have a newspaper subscription or even just a Twitter feed, it is hard to live in this era as an extremely privileged person who perhaps has been going about some of this helpfulness for not a year, but 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and to not be persuaded that it's not working against the fundamental problems in this society. And one of the things I found, and I want to say this thing about, if Donald Trump's done one good thing, because obviously he's done some of the most atrocious things in American history, but if he's done one good thing, I found that among the people I was reporting on, and I was doing this reporting, I started right around the time he started running and continued for the next few years into his presidency, I found that there was, among the rich people that I was writing about, Donald Trump has created an openness to introspection about their roles in a bad system. Because I think if you are a thinking person of privilege or anybody else, and you look at the fact that Donald Trump is now president of the United States, and that we now have a dumpster fire raging through the White House, it is hard to look at that and not say, you know what, I'm probably involved in that in some way. I need to look at myself again. I need to look at my assumptions. I need to look at how I've spent my life. And so I actually wrote about people who are in these spaces, but who were starting to question them and who were starting to wonder whether unwittingly they were, as you say, causing the problems they were also trying to solve, or complicit in those problems, and whether they were kind of fighting two sides of a war.
Okay, now that we know the thesis, let's open it up for discussion here. Matthew, you want to weigh in on whether you think Anand's onto something or perhaps a little off base? What's your take?
Well, I really wanted to like this book when I picked it up because my book, Philanthrocapitalism, came out 10 years ago. In that 10-year period, the phenomena of philanthrocapitalism, of the rich trying to solve the world's big problems, has increased. It's probably one of the few big positive stories in the world. And yet very few people have written seriously about it and looked at it properly and looked at the kind of questions that it does raise. And Anand is right that I certainly have no brief per se for billionaires, and it worries me a bit that they have influence in our society. But for me, I came to the story because they were funding some really profoundly important initiatives. They were changing the world. And unfortunately, Anand's book ends up, I think, wildly misrepresenting what's going on. It's a superficial analysis. It has no answers, really, that are really going to be practical. And what we really needed was a book that looked at what's working from philanthropists and what isn't working, which is a very, very interesting and sort of quite nuanced story. So, for example, there's very little in his book about Bill Gates. For me, Bill Gates is the poster child of philanthrocapitalism. And weirdly, he endorses Anand's book, which I really don't understand, because if anyone should be criticized by his thesis, it's Bill Gates. Bill Gates' activities have saved millions and millions of lives around the world, unquestionably. And so where's the credit for that? And what do we learn from Bill Gates that could be shared with those other philanthrocapitalists out there to actually help them do a better job, which I think they can do, in actually helping us solve these enormous challenges that we're facing at the moment.
Anand, I'm going to have you sit tight and listen to what everybody else has to say, good, bad, or indifferent, and then we'll get you to weigh in on what they have to say. Linda, your view.
Well, first of all, I found the book really interesting and very powerful. I just think it makes some excellent points that, of course, obviously, generosity on the part of the rich, some good things have been done. But the real question is, the rich have become enormously powerful. They enjoy wealth and power concentration like they haven't for,
centuries.
And they've used that power not just to give money away, but to remake society, remake the economy very much to their favor, cutting taxes for themselves, gutting labor laws, putting in trade deals that favor them. All those kinds of things are responsible for them being so much more powerful than they've ever been and so much richer. And what is it that all this philanthrocapitalism does to address that? That's the root of the problem of the tremendous inequality that we have today. And yet philanthrocapitalism, as Anand says, that's the last thing it wants to address. It wants to create situations where they can get spin-off benefits often economically. And above all, it doesn't want to challenge that basic system that they have put in place and that has been so incredibly favorable to their interests.
Rudyard, you advise some of the wealthier charitable foundations and families in this country. What's your view on what you've heard?
Well, two observations. One, absolutely, over the last decade, we've seen this incredible appreciation of assets. And those assets have appreciated not only in people's stock portfolios, but within foundations' endowments. And wherever you get a large appreciation of capital, I think that warrants investigation. It warrants reflection on the part of society as to how is that capital being deployed? Is it efficient and effective? And is it achieving goals? Especially when it's in a charitable structure that has allowed the people who put the capital there a variety of tax advantages and a variety of frankly, motivations, quite personal, i.e. their after-tax position in many cases to set up and establish these foundations. So I think it's good that we're having this conversation. I think that Canada, thankfully, like the United States, is not as far down this road, and that there are opportunities now to kind of step in and I think about some smarter regulation in terms of the growth of these large foundations and their impact on society. I will say that I think there are malign and good actors in any system. And the example of Gates is an excellent one. There are some philanthropists who are good at it, who have a vision, who are able to execute on it, and are truly concerned about the world's most disadvantaged, regardless of any larger system that they're trying to perpetuate. There are others, though, who are hugely opportunistic, who are greenwashing themselves through their philanthropy.
You want to name names?
No, I'm not going to name names, but we see that especially in the United States. Corporations are notorious for this. Nike, we can all look at the Colin Kaepernick ad and have a debate about that. But what's the purpose of supporting his charity? Is it really to advance the issues and causes that are confronting black men in America, or is it to sell more Nike sneakers? It's probably the latter, Stephen. So look, there's good.
Could be a little bit of both, actually.
I mean, there's good and bad actors. That's my point. And I think further to Matthew's point, why not investigate what the good actors are doing, why they're successful, understand that, yes, there are people who I think a spotlight of scrutiny needs to be shined on and whose beliefs need to be challenged. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay. Anand, you've heard some of the criticisms of what you've had to write. You want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, in terms of Matthew calling my book superficial, I just want to say in my defense, I am only superficial on the surface. I'm much deeper deep down. Second of all, I only was able to write this book because of people like Matthew who have jobs. Matthew works for the Rockefeller Foundation, right? And there were a lot of people like Matthew who have to take the kind of line he took here on TV in his day job. And who would
Although
take that
when I
line,
wrote my book, I was working for The Economist as a journalist,
Correct.
and I was reporting
Can
what I saw as the fact. Well, yeah, but you just accused me of
you let me
reacting
finish my
out of some
sentence?
professional having sold my soul to philanthropy. I wrote a book as a journalist that
Can you actually let me finish?
I will do, but I don't want
can you let me finish?
your superficiality to continue to actually put me in a bad light. So thank you.
We'll do this again when he's going to be respectful.
Okay. Well, there's a first for everything. And I
Well,
think
we're here
that's
to debate the
first.
facts.
I don't know if you can see him there and urge him to come back, but if you can't,
I'm afraid there's a door between us now, as well as a
there is a door. Okay. Well, let's continue anyway here. Where do we want to pick up? I think the point you were making, Matthew, was that you were working as a journalist with The Economist when you wrote your book 10 years ago, and therefore the views that you've just expressed on television are not, quote unquote, bought and paid for by the Rockefeller Foundation. Have I got that right?
Precisely. I've come to this as a journalist, as a reporter, responding to, seeing what I saw happening in the world. And part of that was that some of these philanthropists, like Bill Gates, I think were doing very positive things. I think are continuing to do positive things. What I think is needed is a proper debate about those that are doing well and why they're doing it, and actually calling out those who aren't doing well. And I think we need to solve these problems. I think Anand does raise a number of very important questions, not least that we are in a world of growing inequality, and we do face enormous challenges. But I think that to simply paint everybody with the same brush and say they are all essentially, at best, lipstick on a pig of a bad system is a counsel of despair, and actually we need to be finding out answers and solutions to actually some of these huge challenges that we face.
Yeah, I don't think anybody is suggesting everybody giving away, all the rich giving away money that they have bad motives or anything like that. Some might be more interested in the prestige that they get, but some are genuinely committed. I guess the question is, does this have a couple of questions. Does this have the effect of whitewashing the situation where they hold so much power and wealth? That is the fundamental problem, and that they don't seem willing to actually question the structure of the economy that has allowed them to be rewarded like that.
How do you answer that question?
Well, let's put it this way. Let me just say, if you go back to the early post-war period, the 50s and 60s, we lived in a much more equal society. There were rich people and middle class, et cetera, but the rich were not so far ahead of everyone else. What's happened in recent years, and it's happened because of a very aggressive push by the business interests, is that they put in place policies that have allowed themselves to become enormously wealthy at the expense of other members of society. They enjoy a much bigger share of the overall wealth of society, the overall GDP, than they did in those earlier years. It's not because the rich today are more talented and more entrepreneurial than the rich were back then. We've always had very talented people in the elite. It's because they've aggressively pushed for these policies that favor their own interests. So if we're going to get at anything that it's going to fundamentally improve the lives of more citizens, we're going to have to challenge some of those things. And I think the point that Anand is trying to get at in his book is that these people that are claiming to reshape the world for better are not willing to look at those problems.
Well, let me ask that to Roger. You work with some of the wealthiest people in the country, the late Peter Monk and Galen Weston. In your experience, did these people ever think that they were somehow giving money away and being philanthropic as a way of compensating for the fact that they had cooked the system in the first place to favor themselves?
Well, I think actually quite the contrary. You know, Peter Monk especially, way before Bill Gates and people like Warren Buffett made it popular, had this idea that society, that Canada, welcoming him as a refugee from Nazi-occupied Europe, had given him everything, and that the wealth that he had accumulated over the course of his life needed to be returned to that society for the betterment of it. And he did that in a spectacular fashion in the final years of his life. $100 million gift to the Cardiac Center at U of T. The Monk School at the U of T also exists now as an institution in perpetuity that will advance a vision of Canada in the world. You know, these were things that Peter acted on, not out of a sense, I think, of some agenda, as some might imply, but rather in the spirit of what good philanthropy is about, which is giving back to the society that gave you everything. I think the motivations, in some cases, not in all cases, Linda, but in some cases, can be incredibly simple and incredibly powerful and positive.
But I guess one of the things when you look at something like the Monk donations is the amount of taxes we lose when charitable donations are made. I recall the Monk donation to the Monk School, I think was $35 million. In fact, after the tax deductions, the donation was closer to, I think, $16 million, and may have even been less depending on how the donation was given. So what you end up with there is a school that is, in fact, you know, there is a contribution from Peter Monk, but there's a huge contribution from the citizens, from taxpayers to build that place. In fact, when you add in the contributions from the federal and provincial government,
which, Linda, I think is why precisely the federal and provincial government often support and act in partnership with philanthropists, because they see the larger public good.
But look what ends up happening. We have the Monk School of Global Affairs. We don't have the Canadian Taxpayer School of Global Affairs with a little help from Peter Monk. The point is, Monk gets all that credit.
I don't think he gets all the credit. I
Well,
think U of T gets all the credit. I think the graduates and staff and faculty get an incredible
guess
amount of credit.
one thing I would say is that when a philanthropist is rewarded by having their name on a building or something, a concert hall or something like that, that's essentially essentially something wonderful for them. You can't buy better publicity than that. That should not be deductible for tax purposes. That should be.
Okay, I'm going to, we have a very delightful development here on the program. I'm looking at a shot of New York City right now, and I see both our guests back there. And I guess, what do we want to do? Anand, I'm delighted that you have returned to your seat. Do you want to just sort of pick up from the point you were trying to make from earlier?
When I was interrupted?
Yes, let's try it without interruption this time, and you make the point, and then we'll let Matthew come back.
I understand that Matthew is a white man of a certain age who thinks that anybody else talking who's not a white man can be interrupted at will. But
okay, we're not going to impute anybody's motive here. Let's just get on with the point that you wanted to make.
The point I wanted to make was that a lot of people who I spoke to for this book are, like Matthew, in situations where they work for these institutions, they believe in these institutions, but they also are paid a salary by these institutions, and their complicated feelings about them cannot all be put on the table. And a lot of the people I spoke to who let me write this and who provided the ammunition for my critiques are actually people, some named and many not named, in these spaces, who feel the way I do within these spaces, but who are stuck and who gave me their truths, their experiences, of feeling that while they were solving these problems in a very real way, they were helping to cause them. So to Matthew's substantive point around Bill Gates, first of all, I think it's worth noting, as you did, that Bill Gates blurbed the book. I think it's worth thinking about why someone like that, who is safe, who doesn't need to make any more money, has no career needs, freer than most people on Earth, why he felt permission to have this critique. If he has truly done as much as he has, and he has done tremendous things for people, why is he open to a book called The Elite Charade of Changing the World? If even he is open to it, I think a lot of us should be more open to it. Here's the substantive point. It is absolutely true, and I say repeatedly in the book, that these kind of initiatives help people, feed the hungry, house the homeless, save lives, millions of lives. I talk about Bill Clinton's initiatives. I talk about the Gates kinds of initiatives, all kinds of initiatives. That is real. What I'm talking about at a more fundamental level is that these efforts leave untouched, in general, the fundamental system that has allowed the very richest people on Earth, the same people we are talking about solving these problems, to siphon almost all the gains from growth upward. I mean, the new numbers last year were that I think 80-something% of new wealth created last year went to the global 1%. You have in the United States over the last nearly 40 years, almost all of the gains from the future going to people on top. We had an amazing array of things happening in this country over the last 40 years. It was not that the rain of the future didn't come down on us, but all of that rainwater was harvested, almost all of it, by people in the top half or top 10% or top 1% of American life.
Let's make sure we get
the question is, in addition, is that do-gooding that is real part of and even an accomplice to a system that may be hurting many, many more people, but in ways that are not so easy to count?
I take your point. I understand your point. Matthew, let me get you to follow up by saying, do you think that the Rockefeller Foundation is out there doing good, in part because it's trying to burnish the reputation of John D. Rockefeller, who was one of the very early capitalist industrialists in the country, with a complicated record on, issues of whether or not he made the system work for him better than for the people he employed?
Yeah, and let me just quickly respond to the personal attack before I come to that answer, because I have an Indian wife born in Trois-Rivières, outside of Montreal. I have a 5-year-old son who is not white, and so I resent,
I hope you don't interrupt them.
Well, obviously I interrupt them as appropriate, but we have lively conversations, and I'm really wanting to focus on the facts. To your point about Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, I think, is one of the products of the golden age of philanthropy at the start of the 20th century, which did help reshape both America and the world, I think, largely in a positive direction as the wealthy responded to the inequality challenges of those days. And I think the foundation continues to fund projects that around the world that basically it is trying to solve big problems like how do you feed the poorest people on the planet in a nutritious way? How do you give people access to renewable energy in parts of Africa and India where they have no energy at all? How do you, sort of avoid babies and mothers dying in the developing world? It's a very, very good thing, as is the Gates Foundation. And I think ultimately, there are a number of the philanthrocapitalists that I write about in the book, and indeed Anand writes about. For example, George Soros, who fundamentally, whatever you think about him, he is trying to change the system. He has brought down governments around the world through the things he's funded. He has promoted transparency in the way that business in the mining industry relates to governments in Africa and around the world where there may have been corruption going on. These people are trying to change the system, and I think we need to learn from what they are doing to find out what works and what doesn't work. And this blanket view that these people are all not challenging the system is just wrong. I mean, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, the biggest philanthrocapitalists of today, have publicly come out and said they should be taxed more heavily. What we can just, and yet they're being tarred as being people who are inevitably funding reductions in taxes. I just think you have to stick to the facts and actually report honestly and accurately, rather than just, like a hammer, see every rich person as a nail.
Okay, Roger Griffiths wanted to add something here.
Well, just one quick point, Steve, which is I think we all admit that the growth of inequality in Western societies is a problem, but to lay that as a phenomenon that emerges out of billionaire capitalism, I think is to misunderstand all the other much more profound effects that are fueling inequality, from U.S. Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United that give corporations free political speech, from K Street lobbyists and the extent to which the American government is infested with a lobbyist culture that changes rules. I just wonder if the emphasis here is a bit overdone and a bit is placed in the wrong area. We can spend a lot of time trying to solve inequality. We should, but to think that both the cause and the solution is exclusively accessed through large-scale philanthropy is somewhat erroneous.
But Rudyard, surely, you talk about Supreme Court decisions, et cetera, lobbying. That comes back to the power of big money.
Well, Linda, I don't deny the power of big money, but let's be clear in our categories here. This is a show about philanthropy, not a show about.
What I'm saying is that the power of the elite, the billionaires, has gotten wildly out of control. And there's something fundamentally undemocratic about that. When we look to philanthropists, to the rich, to solve our problems with the idea that they have some special knowledge, no doubt they have some ideas, but I don't think we want to live in a society where we abdicate all that power and influence to those at the very top. If we taxed billionaires higher, as
Warren Buffett says you should.
As Warren Buffett has argued most eloquently, I love his quotes on that, and he is a real hero, I think. If we followed that, more closely, we'd have the greater tax revenue. Then we could collectively make decisions about where all this money is going to go.
Let me get a sense from Anand about whether or not this is primarily an American phenomenon that you report on, or is it in other places in the world as well?
I learned a long time ago that it's better to bound these things. So I wrote about this as an American phenomenon, and I think it's always better to have people tell you that this resonates with what they're seeing elsewhere, which has been happening a lot. But I do think in many ways it is, a certain part of it is an American. I mean, the rise of the global 1% is not an American phenomenon. But the social choice to have government do less over the last generation, to have billionaires and corporations earn more profits because of lower taxes and less regulation, and then to have some of that money that ends up in their profits and in their wealth solve some of those social problems that government is doing less of. That is a somewhat uniquely American phenomenon. You can see it elsewhere, but we've practiced that kind of game more than others. I think just to pick up on some of the earlier points, one of the things I found in the book is when I was looking at some of the terminology that these folks popularized, win-win, doing well by doing good. You now find like indigent college students in poor countries writing essays on the internet, adopting, like, social change must be a win-win. And my problem with that is it's in the obvious interests of elites to have social change always be a win-win. Because what that means is let's help others in ways that don't hurt us and maybe help us win. Let's do impact investing, social enterprises, make our money, and then do philanthropy. And my concern is not that there aren't some people doing system change. My concern is that our conversation about social change has become one that is dominated by an ethic of the win-win, which is that the most meaningful and important and correct kinds of social change give a kickback to the winners. And I'm concerned about that being a dominant tendency in our culture.
And I think that the bias of a lot of those billionaires is so clearly the market system, out of which they've done so well. If we had more public control over where the money is going, there could be more investment and focus on public solutions.
I see Matthew trying to get into New York. Go ahead, Matthew.
There really are good billionaires and bad billionaires, and there are left-wing philanthrocapitalists and right-wing philanthrocapitalists, and we need to be very clear about that. Part of the success of the moment of the right, I think, in America is due to like a 40-year campaign by philanthropists of the right to try and change the fundamental nature of society, which I think philanthropists on the more progressive side need to learn from and understand how they did that and what worked and again, what didn't.
Okay, let me jump in here because one of the fundamental truths of this business is that our satellites have a finite amount of time and we're about to lose ours to New York City. So we have about a minute and a half to go. Anand, you've heard what you've heard. Do you want to come in with some concluding comments about where we ought to be going with this?
Look, I think you have to decide as a regular citizen listening to this who you want shaping your future. I am not calling for an end to capitalism, an end to philanthropy, or an end to philanthrocapitalism. I am calling for, when you're standing on your feet and you shift your weight from one foot to another, both feet are still on the ground. But I think we have lived in an age that has put way too much weight on the private, on what we do alone, on business, and then on the spoils of business solving social problems. And I'm calling for merely a shift in our weight as a society in the United States to the other foot, to public spirited action, to reforming the deep systems we share in common, to, yes, having rich people pay more taxes, to not have unequal public schools. And I think your viewers and people around the world need to think about, do you want to live in a society fundamentally shaped and reshaped by people who happen to make a great bet on a hedge fund or happen to start a startup in Silicon Valley? Or do you want it to be shaped by you? And that is a fundamental values choice that we all face, and we face acutely in the United States right now.
We should remind everybody, the name of the book is called Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. Anand Giridharadas is the author, and as you can tell, this is a topic that does provoke some passion. So we are delighted that the four of you would come on TVO tonight to talk about it. Anand Giridharadas, Matthew Bishop is in New York City as well, the managing director of the Rockefeller Foundation. His contribution to this many years ago, Philanthrocapitalism, How the Rich Can Save the World. And here in our Toronto studio, Linda McQuaig, journalist, author, The Billionaires' Ball, Gluttony and Hubris in the Age of Epic Inequality, and Roger Griffiths, who is at the Munk School of Global Affairs at U of T and also an advisor to many of the what do we call them? The wealthier foundations in this country.
Foundations.
Large foundations.
Large
Good
foundations.
enough. We shall do that. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.